War protests which marred the return of British soldiers from Iraq. Looking at some of the front pages to give you an idea if you haven't seen them yet. Daily Mail, welcome home. 12 comrades returned from Iraq yesterday to be greeted by this hate-filled mob. Daily Express just called it sickening. You can see some of the placards there. Cowards, killers, extremists. These are accusations against the soldiers. And The Sun, hate for heroes. Well, speaking to GMTV last night, the Shadow Defence Secretary Liam Fox condemned the protest as appalling.
It was particularly vicious. The language that was used was utterly unacceptable. And maybe the people who've been involved in this sort of protest might just want to reflect that if it wasn't for the bravery of the British Armed Forces in fighting for the things that this country stands for, they wouldn't be able to make such a protest. Well,
the Prime Minister Gordon Brown has also spoken of his concern about it, as have many Muslim groups spoken out against the protests and the nature of it. Well, joining us in the studio is Anjem Choudary, head of that group who were protesting yesterday. Were you aware that your conduct and the nature of your protest was going to cause insult?
Well, definitely there will be a reaction to people who condemn the British torture, humiliation and crimes which they have committed in Iraq. There's no doubt that there's a very strong media machine out there which is very effectively covering up the crimes which the British and the Americans have committed in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Abu Ghraib, in Guantanamo Bay, etc. And usually it's only when organizations like ourselves expose those hideous crimes that there is a reaction like this.
So to sum up what you're saying there is that you believe that you were in the right to speak out because you believe that crimes have been committed. You don't have any proof that these soldiers committed any crimes,
Of course we do. I mean, the cases are many. I mean, there's...
These particular soldiers that you're insulting?
No, the Basra Air Base and Detention Centre is famous for atrocities. There was the case of Baha Musa, who was killed by British troops whilst in custody.
I don't want to get into a specific cases.
Well, you're talking about specific cases, but Amnesty International...
I wasn't, actually. I wasn't talking about specific cases. That wasn't actually my question. I mean, there are routes, aren't there? There are routes that you can go through in order to pursue cases. The government says they're looking into it, the Ministry of Defence says they're looking into it, but you are still angry because you feel there hasn't been justice there. But my question really was, were you aware it was going to cause insult to these individual soldiers?
Well, let me deal with your first point first. There are no routes that people can go down to deal with this. This is an illegal war. It's an occupation of land. If the Iraqis were to occupy Britain tomorrow and to slaughter innocent men, women and children and to return home, what type of reaction do you think the British living in Iraq would give them? It's the same reaction that you get from Muslims in Britain. We stand up for the truth. You know, we may be a minority out there, but the reality is that those placards that you see on your screen now reflect the reality of what's taking place in Iraq, and you know, and the people know that already.
Well, you obviously have a very impassioned view of your case, and fortunately, because we live in a democracy, you have the right to make it. But I think the concern here is the nature of your protest, that it was directly insulting to soldiers who'd risked their lives, many of them who'd lost their lives, and that it was likely to cause disturbance and uncomfortableness within the community. Many members of the Muslim community are very unhappy with what you've done. Do you accept some responsibility for the fact that you will have increased tension?
Well, let me ask you a question. How do you think that people should react and demonstrate when innocent Muslims are killed? I mean, we've got a very long memory. Wait a second.
You just asked me a question. Let me answer your question.
I haven't finished asking my question.
Okay.
We haven't forgotten the 500,000 children who've been killed because of the sanctions of the British and Americans in Iraq. We haven't forgotten Hanan Saleh Matrood, an 8-year-old girl who was killed by the American soldiers. We haven't forgotten many of the atrocities which have been committed. So how do you think that we should respond on the streets of Britain to all of those atrocities and the many other torture incidents which have taken place in Iraq? Don't you think that that's a good way to respond, to have a peaceful demonstration and highlight those atrocities? We're not out there calling for violence in Britain. We're merely reflecting what's taking place in Iraq.
You're accusing them of being murderers and killers.
Well, absolutely. Well, what do you think? If you occupy someone's land and you kill... You actually asked me a question,
so can I answer your question now? I mean, there are those who would argue, and we've had many emails and texts on it, that these soldiers are serving a government, democratically elected, which has decided to get involved in a military conflict. If you have a concern about that conflict, then your beef, if you like, is with the government, not with these individual soldiers.
And Adolf Hitler was democratically elected, and what the Nazis did is something in which the people said the same thing. The soldiers who were fighting for the Germans said, we're just soldiers acting on behalf of our government. I don't think that's an excuse.
Many people have asked the question that if you are against the policies of this government that's been democratically elected by the people of this country, not everyone agrees with all the things they do, of course. That's the point of a democracy. We do it by the election box. Why do you stay here?
Well, that's absurd. I mean, I can...
No, it's a question. It might be an absurd one,
because I believe that I have a responsibility to speak up and to enjoin good and forbid evil. My religion of Islam allows me and it demands, in fact, that I propagate Islam and try to implement it wherever I am. So I do that in Britain. And, you know, the fact that you may not like some of my views should not really, end up in a reaction to say, look, get out of our country. I mean, that's exactly what the BNP and the far right say. Anyone who disagrees with their policies, you know, get out of our country.
I've not said that.
But that is,
I've asked why you say that it's a very different thing.
You see, that's the problem is, you see, when it's unpalatable to the general public, suddenly we're outsiders. You know, I was born in this country, so you know, as far as you're concerned, I'm as British as anyone else.
Of course.
The fact that I have a different ideology.
You leave. I just wondered why, if you were so anti everything it stands for.
My point is the fact that I have a different ideology and I have the fortitude, and my friends and brothers have the fortitude to speak up, does not mean that we should leave these shores.
No,
perhaps what we're saying is the truth. Perhaps we have a better ideology.
And the opportunity that you've been given is that you can make those protests. You can make this protest because we live in a democracy. And that democracy, many would argue, many members of the Muslim community are already arguing this morning, is being preserved by soldiers who have fought in wars overseas. Not that the whole country is necessarily agreed.
I'm sorry, but
it's being preserved by them.
What the British and the Americans are doing in Iraq and Afghanistan is not protecting democracy and freedom. You don't use B-52 bombers to carpet bomb people into accepting democracy. That's absurd. They are there to establish their military, their economic, their strategic interests. Otherwise, where are the British and the American soldiers, for example, in Palestine or in the Xinjiang province in China, where people are being abused, or in Chechnya? They're not there because it doesn't serve their interests, their purpose.
Richard Newton says it's a pity that you have conveniently forgotten the torture, murder and racial hatred inflicted by Iraq's now deposed dictator, and how those soldiers, those individual soldiers, possibly, and certainly many soldiers like them, helped the people of Iraq regain their country from him. Why are you not standing up for those people who would like to see that put an end to? War is a mucky business.
Yes, Saddam Hussein is a dictator. So is Hosni Mubarak. So are many of the leaders, in fact, all of the leaders who are leading and ruling over Muslim land. However, they are our dictators. We can remove them. We don't need the British to come there, occupy our land and take our resources. OK,
you've put your case very, very clear of why you're against the war and the British involvement in conflicts around the world. But taking the point of the nature of this protest, we live in a complex and difficult society, a multiracial society, multicultural society, a society with many different religions. We all have to, don't we, take responsibility to not directly insult people in a way that might lead to others coming to harm. There are many members of the Muslim community that are very frightened this morning because they believe, because they look similar to the members of your group, because they have the same religion, although they don't necessarily agree with what you're saying, as the members of your group, they will now be under threat going about their daily lives, even though they're in support of the other side of your argument.
No, I'm sorry, but that's completely ridiculous.
So you don't take responsibility for any further harm?
No, you cannot commit crimes and slaughter people and then say, when people reflect that on placards and they have a demonstration...
I'm asking about you to take responsibility.
Wait a second. It's a peaceful demonstration. Why is it that when 2 soldiers are killed, the people who are demonstrating against an island are praised, but when thousands upon thousands of people are killed, then suddenly that's completely out of order? The problem is, you see, that the general public are in blissful ignorance of what's taking place around the world and in their name. And I think that the fact is, all we're doing is we're presenting that openly, publicly. And the reality is, you see, that if we had this demonstration at another time when the parade was not taking place, it probably wouldn't have got the coverage